My name's Matt McCoy. I'm the chairman of the North Kingstown 350th Anniversary Committee. I have one of my fellow committee members, Mike Donahue, who is with Historic Wickford, who's here today. We're here tonight to hear author and historian Christian McBurney talk about basically quantum machines, World War II,
Pontoons.
Which, if you didn't know, and you will find out, played a big role in many of the amphibious operations during World War II. So Christian is an author. He has his wares here. He's written some very interesting books about World War II here in Rhode Island, Revolutionary War, and also Narragansett Bay, I guess during the Roaring 20s when they had
Rum running, yeah.
So, without further ado, Christian McBurney.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here again in this lovely space. And like my second North Kingstown lecture for the 350th, so quite an honor. Now, how many of you are on my small state big history email list? Raise your hands. Wow, almost, I'd say more than 50%, so that's pretty good. But there's a few of you out there who are not on the list. If you don't know, it's a Rhode Island history blog. I send out an email a week. It's got a Rhode Island history article on it. Some are might be, many are not. Russ DeSimone is here. He's an author. Actually, he's doing a book review that's coming out on Friday of a very important Rhode Island book. So, the articles are meant for popular consumption, and I have 2,500 people on the list, so it's pretty good. A lot of Rhode Island history lovers. So if you're interested, I'm going to send this around, and I've always gotten the pen back. I'm sure I will with this crowd. So, and yeah, if you could put your name and your email address very clearly. It's called Small State Big History. And as Matt said, I do have some books out here, selling them for $20 a piece, except for Dark Voyage, the one on the privateer owned by John Brown of Providence that he sent to Africa to attack British slave trade interests. That's $25. And we've got two books on World War II in Rhode Island. I mean, there's so much was going on in World War II in Rhode Island that we had to do two books. And actually, I could easily do a third, and probably will someday. And this one has color pictures on the front, so that's kind of cool. And here's the new book. This is about the Coast Guard firing Lewis machine guns and Hotchkiss one-pounder cannon at rum runners going up Narragansett Bay as they're trying to bring whiskey and other prohibited liquor during the Prohibition days from 1929 to 1933. That includes the famous Black Duck incidents. Who here has heard of the Black Duck shooting? 4 or 5. That's pretty good. I mean, 6. That's good. That's better than most because when it happened, there were headlines in over 100 newspapers in the country. Okay. Rhode Island's contribution to the World War II effort far exceeded its small size. Its greatest contribution was in training Navy officers and sailors. More than 500,000 recruits were trained at the Newport Naval Training Station. Some 100,000 Seabees were trained at Davisville, 100,000. The other main training ground was in California. Some 20,000 PT boat officers and sailors were trained at Melville. More than 10,000 pilots and 1,000 combat information officers received instruction at Quonset Point, and many of them served on aircraft carriers in the Pacific. Rhode Island was also on the front lines. Aircraft from Quonset Point and destroyers from Newport patrolled Atlantic waters searching for German submarines. Rhode Islanders also manufactured incredible amounts of military equipment and supplies. That's a book in itself. including producing most of the Navy's torpedoes at the torpedo station in Newport. So in this picture, we have Naval Reserve officer candidates who are taking tests at Quonset Point. I've got a chapter about this guy's journal of his time at Quonset Point when he was in these classes. He worked pretty hard. We've got TB Avengers flying over the control tower at Quonset Point, 1943. Of course, that control tower is still standing. Okay, before I get to this, I'd like to give a quiz. Remarkably, 5 current and future U.S. presidents visited or trained in Rhode Island during World War II. Can you name them? Go ahead, shout it out. Nixon. Who said Nixon? Oh, very good. That's one of the hard ones. We'll just talk about Nixon for a second. He was in the Navy Reserve. I have a photo of him at Quonset. He once met a guy named Melvin Laird, who turned out to be his Secretary of Defense. And he said, Melvin, you remember when we were the lowest of the low, lieutenant in the reserves at Quonset Point? So anyway, he received his training there. Kennedy, during the campaign, kind of made fun of him. Oh, he didn't really have a serious, he was flipping hamburgers on an island in the Pacific. But actually, the island where he served was bombed 29 days in a row by the Japanese. Okay, who else? George Bush Sr., that's right. He served on he served down in Charlestown, where they had aircraft carrier training. They actually had catapults, and they would launch him. And in the second book there, I have a chapter on him, and he had incredible love letters to his wife, Barbara. They got engaged while he was there at Charleston. And he also flew, and most of the letters are to his mother. So I think Barbara probably destroyed all of her letters, except for one got away. But the mothers survived, and he did night training. He would, fly up at night. He had no radar, and it scared him. So we were lucky nothing happened there. There were plenty of accidents. Who else?
McGovern?
Excuse me?
George McGovern?
No, he was not president either, by the way. Might have wanted to be president, but no, you already answered. So no, not Jimmy Carter either.
Gerald Ford.
Excuse me? John Kennedy, that's right. I mentioned his name, so you're listening. That's good. And he was famously at the PT boat, PT boat 109, and he got his training at Melville. He did so well that the commander there asked him to stay on and be an instructor, which didn't make him happy. He wanted to be, on the front lines, and he got his wish all right, and had that incredible adventure on PT boat 109. Who else? 2 more.
Gerald Ford.
No. Who was president?
Ronnie Reagan.
FDR. He came in 1940 when there was a lot of construction going on at Quonset Point, actually. He took a boat up there to check it out. And Newport was expanding its naval facilities. I mean, a lot of money was going into Navy facilities at that time. So he came at that point. One more, the hard one, Harry Hoover. Most people say Eisenhower, which there is the Eisenhower House, and he did come here in the 50s after the war, but he didn't come during the war. The hard one is Harry Truman. Now, what would he have been doing 80 years ago, almost 80 years ago, a little more than 80 years ago, here in Rhode Island, 1944? Running for vice president, very good. The day before the final end of the campaign, they had a big rally at Pawtucket Stadium. There were 20,000 people there. It was a big deal. And so he had a big speech there, and then the next day he went to Madison Square Garden, New York City, wound up the campaign. So that's 5 presidents in Rhode Island. That's pretty good. Okay. The Seabees are rightfully renowned for inventing at Davisville and manufacturing at West Davisville Quonset huts that were ubiquitous in all American theaters of war. I even have a picture of one in the Arctic. Of course, these are at Melville, lined up at the PT Boat Training Center. summer of 1942. Here's the CB insignia designed by Frank Infradi of North Providence in 1941, showing a bee carrying a Tommy gun and tools. So, Russell, did I pronounce that incorrectly? Frank
That was close enough.
Infradi?
Infrante, I believe.
Fronte, okay. And so, yeah, great logo. Here's a review of the 77th and 81st Naval Construction Battalions at Camp Endicott. That's what the CB base was called, Camp Endicott. This is May 8th, 1943. What made the CBs very interesting is that there was no age limit. You had guys 30s, 40s, 50s. The key was that they had skills as electricians, as plumbers in construction. That's what was important. But they still had to carry a rifle. So I misplaced a great photo of some of them receiving training, and some of them were a little paunchy and older. They were carrying rifles, going over the big wooden obstacles. So it was, they were expected to be able to handle rifles if they were fired at by the Japanese. This woman here mentioned that her father was in the Seabees at Vietnam, but he didn't think that they were required to do that. And that's not surprising. So many things are more specialized these days. Here's a rare color picture of a CB training to be operated bulldozer at Camp Endicott. Now, of course, the Quonset huts, I think the CB should be just as celebrated for developing and testing pontoons at the Advanced Base Proving Ground at Allen Harbor, also known as Allen's Harbor. What do you guys call it? Allen Harbor or Allen's Harbor? Allen? Allen. I think that's the official name. Pontoons became the ship-to-shore solution for landing and supplying large forces without access to conventional harbor facilities. They were crucial to successful Allied landings in Sicily, the Normandy beaches, and in numerous Pacific islands. The pontoon system was perfected at the Advanced Base Proving Ground located at the northeastern edge of Davisville off Allen Harbor. Here's a photo that Brian Wallen recently sent me. It shows the Advanced Base Proving Ground in May 1943. And you can look at all those Quonset huts there in the lower right, just dozens of them. The far end is where Allen Harbor would be. That doesn't look that developed yet. I think it gets a lot more developed as we'll see. Here it is right here. This is Allen Harbor, and these are some of the pontoon structures that are being developed that you can see. It's amazing to think all that was happening then, and you go there now, and there's nothing there. Captain John Laycock was the man most responsible for pontoon development. He was not based in Davisville, but Davisville was where the pontoon structures were experimented with and developed. In its final World War II form, each pontoon was a hollow steel cube. The steel plates were welded together in a box shape and floated to test that no water would seep inside. So it was very important that they would float. The standard size was 7 feet long, 5 feet wide, and 5 feet deep. Here's an official drawing of two types of pontoon units. The basic one is the first one. That's 7 feet long, 5 feet wide, 5 feet deep. The back one is more of an end of a unit or the front of a unit with the curved end. Here's a good close-up of, looks like two pontoons. Well, no, it's one pontoon. Well, it could be two, actually. I think it's two, side by side. And they're being loaded onto a cargo ship. Here's an aerial view of what was called the Advanced Base Depot. That's also, in the Quonset Point. September 24, 1943. You can see pontoons are stacked up at Quonset Point, at Davisville. Trains carried them from the manufacturer site to here. Those and other equipment are ready to be shipped overseas. So this is Well, you would have had a lot of the wharves, in use at that time as well. Here's a great photo: completed pontoons stacked high at a dock, ready to be shipped overseas. Now, one of the keys to pontoons was that they could be easily attached to each other. There was an interlocking system connected to pontoons, then they could form larger and stronger structures. A pontoon assembly, 6 pontoons wide and 8 long, the most common size used for making larger structures, could carry a 150-ton load. Experiments with dozens of uses of pontoon structures occurred at the Advanced Base Proving Ground at Davisville. I think there was water storage facilities were created, even a prison. During the invasion of Sicily, pontoon causeways were crucial for rapidly unloading cargo-laden vehicles from landing craft. They were called LSTs. LST stood for Landing Ship Tank, but soldiers also called it Large Slow Target. Typically, 2 by 30-foot pontoons were slung along either side of an LST. As the LST approached a beach, the Seabees would cut the pontoons loose from the sides so that they floated alongside the vessel and rode onto the beach on their own momentum. The pontoon causeways were then strung together by the Seabees on the beach. In an experiment at Allen Harbor, the elapsed time from casting free the pontoons to driving the first vehicles from the LST onto the causeway took just 7 minutes. And then they could unload an LST in about an hour. Here are some of the causeways. The pontoons are strung together, and this is a piece of a causeway. Here are the causeways being attached to an LST. And here's a great photo of an LST. You can see the causeways on either side, on the left side and on the right side, port and starboard, I think they call it. You can see the machine guns there, lots of soldiers in the foreground. These were called causeways are in the side position, heading for a beach at Sicily. Some Seabees would actually, as they were released, they jumped on the causeways and held onto them like a surfboard, and they would go into the beach. It was crazy. They were being bombed. It was a little bit nuts. Here's a great photo of causeways in use. You can see the LST out there. It can't come all the way to the shore. It's too big for that. So it needs this little, adaptation here, the causeway, the bridge. In the foreground, you can actually see Italian prisoners of war being marched by military police. And you can see the LSTs. They have a lot of trucks. They have tanks, motorized vehicles, as well as soldiers. This is Kwajalein Island in the Pacific. February 1944, an LST arriving to unload on a pontoon dock structure. So, just, you needed some kind of harbor-type facilities. And these are Seabees assembling a pontoon structure on the fly. Another thing that they did with pontoons were dry docks. In the Pacific Theater, pontoons were configured as dry docks of many sizes. The standard 7 by 30 pontoon dry dock was 215 feet long, 70 feet wide, and with stabilizer towers on its sides, 27 feet high. Here's a great photo. Pontoon structure tested during the war at Point Judith Pond, October 11th, 1943. So it's a floating dry dock. It's just massive. You can see the people barely, they're walking around. Now, on these, seawater was allowed to flood the pontoons to submerge the flat part of the dock, and then that allowed, let's say, a destroyer or cruiser to move over it. Then the water in the pontoon was pumped back in to raise the dock, and the vessel would be maneuvered to stand on the keel blocks affixed to the dock. Early in the war, small dry docks serviced PT boats, but by year's end, Seabees were fabricating enormous floating dry docks capable of servicing battleships. Some dry docks were so large that they had to be turned sideways to be towed through the Panama Canal. And here's a sketch of a dry dock. It says in part, stabilizers connected by walkways, not shown. Each pontoon is connected by air hose to a compressor on a tender barge. The system of pipes and hose to each pontoon deck unit is not shown. So a little more complicated than is shown here. Yet another inventive structure was called a mobile floating airfield. In 1943, one of the war's most interesting innovations was developed at Allen Harbor, a mobile floating airfield, codenamed Project SOC. It was inspired by British Prime Minister Winston Churchill, who expressed his interest to Captain John Laycock in the feasibility of building pontoon landing fields, possibly for the D-Day invasion. But he also could have been thinking about amphibious operations against the Japanese in the Pacific Islands and even India. An experimental floating airfield called a floating pontoon flight deck was constructed by the Seabees at Allen Harbor. There's a great picture. You can see the dry dock on the lower right, but the one in the middle, that's the beginning of the floating airfield deck. You can see some Quonset huts on the right side there. Here's a rare photograph of the experimental pontoon landing facility built by the Seabees in Davisville and floating in Narragansett Bay in November 1943. You can see it's being pulled by tugboats on the sides. On the right side is where you would park the aircraft. It could hold, I think, up to 66 aircraft. And on the left side is the landing dock. The floating airfield structure was 1,810 feet long and 272 feet wide. Measured another way, it was 312 pontoons long and 38 pontoons wide, and used a total of 10,291 pontoons. That's a lot. The steel deck, flight deck was 175 feet wide. Off to the side was a more narrow parking strip that could hold at least 90 aircraft with wings folded. Connecting the flight deck and parking strip were 7 bridges with open water in between the bridges. Tugboats towed the floating pontoon structure. In November 1943, the pontoon landing field was towed into a cove in Narragansett Bay with about 100 Navy officials on board. During testing, Navy planes from Quonset Point successfully landed on it and took off from it. More intensive testing was done through January 1944. A total of 140 successful takeoffs and landings were recorded in both smooth and rough waters, including 9 at night using torch pots for deck lighting. They didn't have electrical lighting they could use. So here's a photo of a landing by an SBD Dauntless on November 4th, 1943 in Narragansett Bay. If anyone can figure where that is exactly, that would be interesting, but not easy. Photo of TBF Avengers after they had landed on the mobile floating airfield November 4th, 1943. You can see an oil tanker there, or gas, that's where the gas would be to gas the airplanes up, and some Navy personnel there. Refueling of an aircraft was conducted by gasoline trucks driven on the mobile airfield that were refilled from a pontoon-fueled barge. The pontoon airfield had some advantages over aircraft carriers. No arresting gear was needed or used for landings and takeoffs, and landings could be executed at shorter intervals. So on aircraft carriers, you always had these, the arresting gear that they had to catch with the hook, otherwise could be a big accident. Didn't have to do that here. But, some of the disadvantages, there are no living quarters. You still had to have Navy people doing the work here, but there are no living quarters on board. That's one problem. Obviously not very maneuverable, and didn't have a good defense. In further testing, the floating pontoon flight deck was towed to the open ocean, but it suffered damage. It was decided that using it in waters more turbulent than those of Narragansett Bay was not feasible. In addition, further field support would be needed, including living quarters for personnel and fuel barges. The experimental floating airfield was subsequently dismantled, and the once promising Project SOC was canceled. However, consideration of the concept has resurfaced several times since, most recently for use by the U.S. Navy in the smooth waters of the Persian Gulf during the first Persian Gulf War. All right, let's talk about rhinos. Allied D-Day planners wanted to bring ashore at Normandy as many tanks, trucks, and other motorized vehicles as possible. Not only on the day of the invasion was to commence, which was D-Day, but also in the days that followed, D-Day +1, D-Day +2, etc., before more permanent harbor facilities could be constructed. And for those of you who know D-Day, you might know there were the Mulberry Harbor facilities constructed by the English, and that was a pretty incredible feat as well. But a storm came along like 6 days later and just totally destroyed them. The tanks and trucks for the invasion of the Normandy beaches would be loaded off the coast in England on the all-important LSTs, landing ship tanks. But these large, heavy transport ships had deep drafts and therefore could not unload tanks and trucks onto beaches that had a flat slope. If the LSE tried to do so, the tanks and trucks would, once they drove off the LSTs, would be underwater, and that would not be good. You can see how massive the LST was, and you've got a rhino on the side there on the right side. But you know that can only get so close to a flat beach on the Normandy beach, so there has to be a solution to get the tanks and trucks and soldiers on board, on the beaches, mostly the tanks and trucks. When confronting beaches, yeah, I think that's fine. Here's a design for the rhino. 208 pontoons are used, 175 feet long, 42 feet wide. Loading in the rear, that's where it will connect to the LST, and a landing ramp in the front. 1 foot 3 inches of freeboard when loaded. So if it's fully loaded, you've only got 1 foot 3 inches before the raging sea is there. A tugboat on each side provides the propulsion. Here's a good view of a rhino alongside an LST off the coast of France, June 10th, 1944. You can see it's taking trucks and soldiers and the like. The Rhino ferry was designed for short cross-channel operations like the D-Day invasion at Normandy. It was composed of 180 interlocked standard-sized pontoons, 6 across and 30 long, and was powered by the largest outboard engines then available. Some of them had a power motor inside of them, built up inside. They weren't using tugs. Special curved face pontoons were placed at the bow and stern. The ferries had steering gear, a speed of about 4 knots, a shallower draft than landing craft, and could carry a load of 275 long tons. Over 85% of all tanks and other vehicles landed on the American beaches at Normandy in the first 10 days came ashore on CB-piloted Rhino ferries. That's amazing. In August 1943, Seabees conducted key tests of rhinos at the Advanced Base Proving Ground at Davisville, observed by senior U.S. Navy and British Admiralty officials. A friend of mine recently discovered a document that summarized observations by the British Admiralty. It was by a Major M. McLaurin. Now, why he was a major, I'm not sure. He could be a Marine, let's say. He attended the testing of various pontoon structures at the Advanced Base Proving Ground in Davisville in August of 1943. McLaurin was a staff officer from the British Admiralty, the equivalent to the U.S. Navy Department. Here's a part of the text I'll read to you of Major McLaurin's report on the testing of pontoons at the Advanced Base Proving Ground in August 1943, almost a year before the D-Day invasion. Here's a quote. The joint U.S.-British demand for pontoon equipment has been sent to BAD, Washington, by Admiralty under 3 heads. A, causeways for bridging the water gap. We talked about causeways. B, floating docks for landing craft. We talked about them. C, small assemblies required by the Army. We didn't talk about that. That was probably, bridges across rivers, for example, the Rhine River or something. A total of 11,578 pontoons plus floating docks. While at Quadrant, that's a big D-Day name for the organizing it, I flew down to the advanced base proving ground for this equipment at Quonset, Massachusetts. Oh, Massachusetts. It's Rhode Island. All right, we all know it was Rhode Island. So, on Narragansett Bay, even more proof, to see a demonstration of a self-propelled ferry made up of pontoon equipment. I was very much impressed by what I saw, and I believe these ferries will be the solution to many of our difficulties of bridging the water gap between an LST and the shore on a flat beach slope. The prototype ferry is made up of 6 strings of U.S. Naval landing pontoon equipment, each 30 units long. The approximate dimensions are thus 150 feet by 42 feet. It has been called a rhino ferry as it has a steel horn forward. I don't know if anyone knows what that means, but maybe you can tell me at the end. A rhino has a steel horn forward, which fits into a hole in the ramp of an LST. So that's how it connects with the LST. Excuse me, forgot to ask for water. I'll survive. The draft of the ferry, of course, depends on the load. If the tanks are being discharged, it can be loaded to a draft of 4 feet, about 10 to 12. That's carrying about 10 to 12 40-ton tanks. Ferry will then ground in 4 feet, and tank can wade ashore. If lorries or trucks are being discharged, load must be restricted to attain a draft of 2 feet 6 inches, about 40 large trucks, so that the trucks can wade ashore. The ferry is propelled by 2 propelling units, each one with outboard and 1 inboard engine, and is extremely maneuverable. Excuse me. Thank you so much.
No problem.
It's quick work. So this is Major McLaurin still going on. It has a ramp forward for vehicles to land over, and a further development may be a ramp at each end. 10 30-ton tanks and 2 half-track vehicles have been offloaded from an LST onto the ferry in 4 minutes, and it's estimated that an LST could be discharged in 2 or 3 round trips, depending upon the load. The ferry can be towed astern of an LST at a speed of about 8.5 knots. It has been tested in rough water, but further trials will be necessary. If all the trials are satisfactory, the use of the Rhino ferry will obviate the necessity of beaching and laying out the LSTs, and may also be found very useful for discharging MT ships. Those are large merchant transport vessels, instead of having to discharge them into LCTs, landing craft tank, or LBVs, landing barge vehicle. It was necessary to give the Americans an indication of what our requirements would be. We learned from them that it was no good our putting in an unduly large demand. A paper was accordingly put into PD, Admiralty, asking for a total of 11,880 pontoons and 240 propelling units, plus the floating docks already asked for by the Admiralty. This number of pontoons is equivalent to 55 ferries, which we reckon we should require. The proposal is to break about half of these down to form the small assemblies required by the Army, which will be wanted when port work starts, by which time the flow of vehicles over the beaches will be diminishing. So this above report is the most detailed yet published on the importance of rhinos, and I published it in a Small State Big History article, if you look under the category of World War II. The numbers of rhinos actually used on D-Day were as follows. At Utah and Omaha beaches, 31, so that's by the Americans. At Sword, Juneau, and Gold beaches, those are the British and Canadians, 41. Total rhinos, 72. So the British received 41 rhinos, not the desired 55, and the U.S. received 31. Again, over 85% of all vehicular equipment landed on the American beaches at Normandy in the first 10 days came ashore on these CB-inspired rhino ferries. There's a recent book on oral history of D-Day by Garrett Graff entitled When the Sea Came Alive. And he has a quote from Lieutenant Dean L. Sullivan of the 11th Naval Construction Battalion, Seabees. Quote, "We manned pontoon barges, rhinos, that offloaded LSTs of men, tanks, trucks, artillery, jeeps, a mile or more offshore, and brought them into the beach. Each rhino could take the full load of an LST. We trained for months along the English and Welsh coast till we could hook up to and unload an LST in less than 30 minutes. We had, I believe, 18 rhinos, and each unloaded 3 or 4 LSTs on D-Day at Omaha Beach." It's amazing. For most of D-Day, we were under fire from German gun emplacements, and Omaha was where the worst German opposition was, of course. And we did hit and explode a few mines, but our casualties were light considering all that was happening. Here's a rhino ferry carrying military vehicles unloaded from an LST in the English Channel off of Slapton Sands Beach. That was where a lot of the training was occurring at sea doing pre-invasion exercises. You can see the name of the tank there. It's called, they like to name the tanks. Can you guys read it? Another great photo of rhino just unloaded from the LST. Both of these photographs were released on D-Day, June 6, 1944. Here's a very rare photograph that a friend of mine sent to me. It's you can see 3 black soldiers are on a jeep coming off the rhino. What makes this rare in particular is that the black soldier is carrying a rifle. Great photograph to have associated with the rhino. Craig L. Simons, in his book Operation Neptune, the D-Day landings and the Allied invasion of Europe, discusses the 3 stages of work of rhinos on D-Days. And I don't know if some of you might have heard Simons or read his books. He's a very well-established World War II at sea writer, and he was a professor at the Naval War College for many years. Simons said of rhinos generally, while the LCTs and Higgin boats carried the soldiers, the work of transporting the vehicles and heavy cargo fell mainly on the big flat barge-like rhino ferries, which had 6 times the capacity of an LCT, and 10 times that of a Higgins boat. First, the rhinos were towed by the LSTs. The weather was cold and choppy on June 6. The big hemp tow lines would slack on the water and then jerk taut, sometimes knocking the Seabees off their feet. The rhinos were essentially flat metal barges, so they offered no protection at all from the waves that sloshed across the decks or the cold winds that whipped around them. The Seabees had to stamp their feet to keep their lower legs from going numb. Now, the second part was after the rhinos and their CB crews had come across the English Channel under tow. When they arrived off the invasion beaches, they first had to cast loose and motor around the bow of the LST to open up. You remember they had those little connections that would hook onto the LST from the rear. They had to unhook. Some found that difficult to do. The choppy sea had so strained the towing shackles that many of them had bent. On one rhino ferry, the Seabees labored for more than an hour, cursing, sweating, and scrambling, trying to unshackle the disfigured couplings. All the time, the skipper of the LST stood at the stern of his ship, megaphone in hand, yelling at them to get on with it. Now, after the rhinos liberated themselves, they then had to maneuver around to the bow of the LSTs, and that too proved difficult. The rhino barges were particularly unwieldy in rough weather, and it definitely was a heavy sea at that point. Some of the steel cables used to connect the two vessels snapped like a kite cord, as one sailor put it. In at least one case, a sea bee jumped into the chill water to retrieve the loose end of a parted chain. Once the rhino was finally in place, the LST lowered its ramp, and the tanks and fully loaded trucks drove out of their ship's tank deck onto the rhino's big flat exposed surface. As they did, the rhino settled deeper and deeper into the water until sometimes there was only a few inches of freeboard. Water, quote, began to wash over the stern, as one CB recalled, and soon everyone on the rhino was wet from the knees down. To make matters worse, an occasional wave of frigid water would break over the crews. But it was worth the suffering to deliver the tanks and trucks onto France's beaches. Here's another great photo of rhino in action on D-Day at Omaha Beach. A rhino ferry unloads U.S. trucks and soldiers onto a Normandy beach during the invasion of Normandy. So you can really see how jammed that rhino is, full of soldiers as well as trucks. Looks like truck transports. Here's well, I'll just do one more photo. Here's a helmet of Seabees at the World War II Foundation Museum. I don't know if you guys know about the World War II Foundation Museum, but it is actually one of the most outstanding small World War II museums in the country, if not the outstanding one. So, and it's right in Wakefield. I know that's a long trip for you guys, but it's worth it. Here's a tribute to the pontoon by Rear Admiral Louis B. Combs. When the history of World War II is written, it will record that the lowly pontoon played a significant role in virtually all of the major campaigns. Thank you.
I may have missed it, but where do they construct the actual pontoon, the square?
You didn't miss it. I did say. I didn't find out where they manufactured it. I would like to know. I'm sure it was in New England, could have been in Rhode Island. It was fairly simple, basically it was a steel box. Right. But it had to have certain interlocking parts so they could all hook together. But it was fairly simple. But and they would bring it in by trains, drop it off at the advanced base depot. But I need to find that information out.
Right in the previous photo, was those dirigibles in the background?
I was looking at them. I don't think they're. Yes, yeah, they are. Yeah. Yeah. So I guess the German guns couldn't reach that far. So.
Well, they used to create cables below them as an air defense measure. And actually, many of the African American soldiers that are referred to were with barrage balloon units at Normandy during D-Day.
I didn't know that. So a lot of, if you didn't hear that, a lot of African American soldiers manned the barrage balloon cables on D-Day. So these dirigibles would be held in place by cables. On I believe on Navy ships, of course, right? Russ?
Yeah, the use of pontoons, I know they used pontoons in the Civil War, basically moving boats and plank stuff. But do you know how early pontoons were used in military history?
I don't. I do know they were used in the Civil War, especially by the Union Army. They were very effective. I did, in Revolutionary War, which I do a lot of work on, they would have small boats all next to each other, so you could just walk across. You couldn't do that too far, of course, but they were. I'm not sure about World War I. Good question. It's a very under-reported, underappreciated aspect, I think.
You mentioned that in that one photo, it was unusual for a black soldier to carry a gun. Why is that?
Because most of the black soldiers were in services, especially in the Navy. They mostly were cooks or personal servants and the like. It was very.
Black units.
They did have some combat units, not very many. They had a famous tank one. Of course, they had the Tuskegee Airmen, who were very effective. But the great majority, unfortunately, it's hard to believe, it was a segregated army. We're fighting World War II, but that's the way it was. And they didn't have that many rifle units that were African Americans.
Any other questions?
I wasn't here earlier because I had another meeting, but did you talk about the modern equivalent and how this evolved into what the Navy uses today?
No, why don't you enlighten me? Enlighten us, excuse me.
If this is the genesis of it, but the Navy uses today a thing called LASH, L-A-S-H, lighter aboard ship something. And it's essentially the same thing. They're floating pontoons that are connected together.
Are they steel or plastic?
Out of steel. And the need for this sort of thing still exists.
Could I ask you, wasn't that over in Gaza?
Yes.
Wasn't that the
we
system used over there?
I don't
It
know.
lasted a couple of weeks.
I believe that was a harbor facility, like it was a dock from.
Joint logistics over the
I believe it was a dock. Yeah, so it was probably using some of the same concepts, but it was more like a dock. It wasn't floating, But it didn't work very well either, I guess, unfortunately. They shut it down pretty quickly.
Well, a lot of times you need to set up operations very quickly, and you don't have the ships and the manpower and this and that. And this thing that we use nowadays called LASH is this equivalent where you can set up a mechanism to get cargo people ashore real quickly.
Interesting. Yeah, still have a need for it, don't you? Yeah.
I just want to make two observations. One, I think this would be a wonderful thing for the Washington Bridge in Providence.
A temporary solution for the Washington Bridge in Providence, yes.
Rhode Island's role in the Second World War, one of the interesting things were these inflatable rubber tanks out of Woonsocket. And they were used to deceive the Germans as to where the landing would be in D-Day. I just found that rather interesting.
Yes, you're talking about the inflatable tanks, and they did manufacture a lot of those in Woonsocket, which had a big rubber industry. All very secret. During the war, you had to be hush-hush. And in UK, they had this large division formations that were, I think, in the eastern part of England, kind of throwing them off. Oh, we might land over, much farther to the west or east. But their biggest use was during real campaigns in Europe, and they would be a whole place where a division should be, and they would have these fake divisions. They'd rubber tanks. They'd have speakers with sounds of tanks. They'd constantly, same ones would be going by, and all sorts of sounds and noise and sights. And if the Germans ever found out about it, they could easily attack and would have ruined the entire American position, but it never happened. They were fired on once by American division. Said, "Hey, there's not supposed to be an American division there," and so they started firing artillery at the poor guys, the rubber tanks, which wasn't very fun. But a lot of these guys were artists and that kind of thing, sound people. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.